Welcome to this explainer. Today we are putting on our detective hats. You see, the ultimate goal of all scientific research, the absolute holy grail, is finding the true causal effect. We want to know, with absolute certainty, what actually causes what. But the road to that truth, well, it's paved with saboteurs. We're talking about hidden errors and really subtle distortions that can completely derail a study, leading scientists and all of us who read their findings down the wrong path. So today, we're hunting down those errors.
Look, we've all experienced this exact frustration. You open the news one morning and read a startling headline, "Coffee causes cancer." Then, 3 months later, you see another headline, "Coffee prevents cancer." I mean, why do some scientific studies get it so wrong? How can observation lead to completely contradictory results? Well, in epidemiology, there are specific suspects that sabotage our investigation for the truth. These suspects are known as biases. And to become a truly informed consumer of data, you've really got to know how to spot them.
Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start with systematic versus random error. Then we'll track down selection bias, information bias, and confounding before wrapping up with how we can actually report better science.
Okay, let's jump right into part 1, systematic versus random error. Before we can go hunting for the specific culprits that ruin scientific studies, we have to make one absolutely fundamental distinction. We need to know the difference between a random accident and a systematic crime. Every single study has error, but not all errors are created equal. Take random error, for example. This is just chance variation or sampling variability. It threatens a study's precision. Basically, if your sample size is too small, you're going to get more random error. The good news here is that statisticians can actually address random error using mathematical tools like p-values and confidence intervals. But what if the target itself is just in the wrong place? That's systematic error. That is bias. Bias is a fundamental departure from the truth. It threatens the actual validity of the entire study. And here's the kicker. You cannot fix bias with p-values or a bigger sample size. If your study design is fundamentally flawed from the start, surveying 10,000 more people, that's just going to give you 10,000 more flawed results.
Let's look at this target practice analogy, because it brilliantly illustrates the difference. Look closely at population A on the left. All the shots are clustered tightly together right in the bullseye. So that is highly precise and highly valid. Now look at population B in the middle. The shots are tightly clustered together, meaning they're very precise. Low random error, right? But they are completely missing the bullseye. That is systematic error. That is bias. They are precisely wrong. Finally, population C over on the right shows shots scattered all around the bullseye. It lacks precision because of high random error, but it's actually valid because on average, it centers right on the truth. Our goal in science? Don't be population B.
Moving right along to section 2, selection bias. Let's talk about the roster.
Let's see how this builds our case by bringing in our first major suspect category, one that strikes before the experiment even really gets going: selection bias. This is defined as the distortions that result from the procedures used to select subjects, or the factors that influence whether they participate and actually stay in the study. Simply put, this is all about the roster. It happens when the study population just doesn't accurately represent the target population. I mean, think about it. Who gets picked for a study? Who refuses to join? Who agrees? And who actually sticks around until the very end? If any of those questions are answered unevenly, you've got a skewed sample.
It is incredibly fascinating to map out this exact skew. In a perfect world, our study sample would be this flawless miniature reflection of the general population. But imagine a scenario where the worried well, healthy people who are just naturally a bit anxious about their health and super proactive, have a much higher probability of volunteering for your study. This creates an immediate imbalance. The healthy exposed group suddenly becomes way overrepresented in your sample compared to the real world. Before you've even analyzed a single data point, your entire baseline is totally biased.
Let's move to section 3. Information bias, or flawed data.
Our next suspect is information bias. Now, this one doesn't derail the study by manipulating who makes it onto the roster. Instead, it ruins things through how the data itself is systematically collected. Information bias happens when the exposure, the outcome, or maybe both are measured systematically incorrectly. In the epidemiological world, we call this misclassification. Basically, researchers end up classifying participants as exposed when they actually weren't, or as diseased when they're actually perfectly healthy. It's a massive measurement error that completely warps the final results.
There are a few specific ways this flawed data collection shows up, and we really need to understand the distinction. First, we have non-differential versus differential misclassification. Non-differential just means the measurement error happens equally across all your groups. It's definitely not great, but it usually just kind of dilutes your findings, making it harder to see a true connection. Differential misclassification, on the other hand, that is much worse. That's when the amount of error differs wildly between the groups, completely throwing off the comparison. Two of the absolute worst offenders here are recall bias and detection bias.
This quote brilliantly illustrates detection bias. This comes straight from the Strobe guidelines, which are pretty much the gold standard for epidemiological reporting. It says, if diabetic women receive more regular and thorough eye examinations, the ascertainment of glaucoma will be more complete. Think about what that actually means. We also call this medical surveillance bias. A study might look at the data and conclude that diabetes causes a massive spike in glaucoma. But the reality? Diabetic patients are just visiting the eye doctor way more often. So of course their underlying conditions are going to be detected at a higher rate than patients who aren't getting that same level of medical surveillance. The surveillance itself is artificially inflating the disease numbers.
And then we have recall bias. This one is notoriously common in retrospective case control studies. Imagine you're conducting a study on the risk factors for breast cancer by interviewing women about their past habits. Women who have tragically just received a breast cancer diagnosis are highly likely to search their memories much more thoroughly than a healthy control group. They might remember every single potentially risky thing they were exposed to over the last decade, trying to find a reason, right? While the healthy group just forgets half of what they did. This uneven recollection massively exaggerates the relationship between a potential risk factor and the disease. The patient's current disease status is literally altering the data being collected about their past.
On to Section 4, confounding, the hidden variable.
So the crucial point here is that we need to shift our focus to a completely different kind of suspect. This one isn't a measurement error, and it isn't a roster error. It's a shapeshifter. Let's talk about confounding. Our sources make it very clear that bias and confounding are not the same thing. Bias comes from flawed information or selection. Confounding, though? Confounding produces relationships that are actually factually correct in the data, but they absolutely cannot be interpreted causally. Why? Because there's this underlying, unaccounted for third factor, a hidden variable that's associated with both the exposure and the outcome. It mixes the effects all together, making two totally unrelated things look like cause and effect.
Take this slightly humorous yet honestly perfect example from our sources. Do swimsuits cause sunburn? If you just run the raw data, you will absolutely find a really strong, statistically significant association between people wearing swimsuits and people getting sunburned. The math is factually correct. But come on, obviously the fabric of the swimsuit isn't what's burning the skin.
The true hidden confounder here is unprotected exposure to the sun. People wearing swimsuits are vastly more likely to be out in the blazing sun than people wearing winter coats. If you sit indoors in your living room in a swimsuit all day, you're never getting a sunburn. That third variable effect is exactly what ruins our estimate of the association. The third variable is tied to both the exposure and the disease, completely tricking researchers into seeing a causal link where there literally is none.
Finally, Section 5, reporting better science. Now that we've identified our main culprits, selection bias, information bias, and confounding, we aren't just going to leave you empty-handed here. Let's transition to the solutions. How is the scientific community fighting back? Well, because bias is almost always introduced during the design or implementation phase of a study, you can't easily fix it later with math. You have to prevent it up front. Researchers use a specific toolkit to do this. For example, they might introduce a washout period, which is a substantial gap between observations to help minimize that recall bias we talked about. They might rely on hard, objective hospital records instead of subjective patient memory. They rigorously standardize their sampling methods so the worried well don't skew the roster. And importantly, they blind both the participants and the researchers. If an interviewer doesn't actually know the study's hypothesis, they can't subconsciously gather data selectively. It totally eliminates observer bias.
To strictly enforce these practices, the scientific community relies on frameworks like Strobe. This stands for the Strengthening the Reporting of Observational Studies in Epidemiology Guidelines. Quite a mouthful, but Strobe essentially acts as the gold standard checklist. It forces scientists to transparently report exactly how they recruited their subjects, exactly how they measured their data, and how they adjusted their statistical analyses to account for those tricky confounding variables and medical surveillance biases. It really is the ultimate defense against bad data.
And that brings us to the absolute most important takeaway for you today. The next time you open up your news feed and see some startling medical headline, before you completely change your diet or throw away your coffee machine or start panicking about a new risk factor, put on your detective hat. Ask yourself, who is actually in the study population? How did they measure the data?
Is there a hidden third variable at play here? By understanding these epidemiological biases, you're no longer just a passive consumer of the news. You are equipped to ask the real question. Is this the precise valid truth, or is it just bias? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the data.